Hello. Today I'd like to talk about the 8th house of the horoscope. After my last video, you left a lot of comments and questions about it, and you mentioned that the topic of the 8th house turned out to be very interesting for you, and you would like to clarify some more points. Now, today I want to discuss the 2nd and the 8th houses of the horoscope, and to do it in the context of a child horoscope. What needs to be done to meet the needs of a child who has Lagnesh in the 8th house? I want to expand on this topic a little and set a wider stage for the video in order to make it useful not only for those who have children with Lagnesh in the 8th house, but also for those who have children with an emphasized 8th house in the horoscope. We will take grahas such as the Moon, Mercury, Mars and Venus and place them in the 8th house, and if your child has such positions in the horoscope, then this video may be useful to you. We will discuss the strategy each parent can take to communicate with such a child more effectively in order to help them develop in this life. What is the general problem of people who have a pronounced 8th house in the horoscope? We have talked about the fact that this house is associated with tension, and this is the house of the adult world where we already have experience behind us, and we can apply this experience in our life, build complex logical chains and make breakthroughs. We must particularly abandon our self here and make some adjustments in our personality and experience fear. It is a very intense experience, and thus we will transform and resurrect through the 9th house of the horoscope. It is a way of evolution. But for a child, this is a problem. He still has somewhere to evolve. First, a child needs to gain life experience and develop a personality so that there is something to give up, something to transform, and therefore, going to the 8th house in its global meaning is very premature. When such a person is born, he immediately brings into the family their agenda of the 8th house, and if you are the mother of such a child, or a father, then these topics will be very useful to you, and you will need to start paying attention to the area of the 8th house. Earlier, I talked about planets such as the Moon, Venus, Mars and Mercury. These are the planets that raise a person from the very beginning. There are natural periods of the planets, and they do not depend on what period you live in Vimshottari Dasha. Our childhood begins with the period of the Moon, and then it continues with the natural period of Mars, then the period of Mercury, and when puberty begins, the period of Venus. These are the 4 grahas closest to the Earth, and they shape our childhood. And if any of these grahas get into the 8th house, then there is already a certain lack of understanding what to do with it, because the graha finds itself in a house that is associated with death, transformation, rebirth, and a wide variety of dangers in life. Surely you know that there is such a thing as Balarishta when the moon sits in the 8th house. This is the most basic condition for Balarishta. In fact, this is a very common concept, and perhaps we will talk about it in another video. But for now, let's say that the moon in the 8th house of the horoscope indicates that a child under the age of 8 is in danger and needs to be looked after. This is easily explained logically, because if a child has the fastest planet that forms pictures in his mind in the house of dangers, crises and various sudden circumstances, then the child will be pulled there instinctively at the mind level. If Lagnesh is there, the same will happen, but at the body level, the child will instinctively position himself somewhere in a dangerous environment. Such people are very necessary for the system. They are born to make breakthroughs, to facilitate processes, to deal with issues that not all people know how to deal with. Issues of death, issues of fear, and deep research. But first, these people must grow up and develop a very strong personality. And if you look at the Scorpio in the natural zodiac and its qualities, then these will be such qualities as fearlessness and the ability to dive deep, the ability to abandon some of the settings in their life. This is a sign that signifies shame, genitals, death, nightmares, and what torments a person from the outside of the system from his past, because this sign is also associated with the power of Ketu. We talked about this in another video, and I will leave a link to it under this one. There I covered quite deeply the topic of the 8th house and its extended meanings. But what should a parent do when he has such a child? Well, to start with, as I said, you need to pay attention to this area of life, to the 8th house, and try to get in touch with these qualities within yourself. Because such a child needs a strong adult who is not afraid of these topics. And then we mentioned an interesting detail, that the 8th house and the 2nd house always work together. They mirror each other, and this is a matter of correcting the horoscope. For example, you see that a person has a major disharmony in life, and for example, he has 4 planets in the 8th house, and these are not the strongest positions. There is definitely some problem there. And someone wrote to me in the comments that you can immediately give up on such charts because everything is very bad. But I do not agree with this opinion, because I believe that while a person is alive, giving up on him is illogical at the very least. Looking at horoscopes of dead people, we can bury them as many times as we like, analyze them from different angles, tell a variety of horror stories. But if a person is still alive, he always has a chance to escape a difficult situation, no matter how it looks in the horoscope. And how to get a person out of the 8th house if there is a difficult situation? You need to jump into the 2nd house and try to press some buttons there if possible. If a person with an active 8th house has a lot of problems in life, this means that his 2nd house was not developed enough, it was not upgraded, and he somehow does not use his powers in the right way. He gets lost. If the 2nd house is developed and there's a lot of energy, a lot of potential, you receive love and support in childhood, no one disturbed your self-esteem and it was only supported by your parents, then you will definitely have a chance to reveal the planets in the 8th house in their positive sides. If that wasn't the case, then of course a crisis prevails in life, a feeling of fear, hopelessness, feeling of abandonment. As if you were thrown into a quiet whirlpool and you haven't been taught to swim and you're drowning. This can be the feelings of a person with an active 8th house, if everything is complicated there and there is no support from Jupiter or from their benefics. These are difficult situations and they really do happen. You can tell such a person that everything that is scary and everything he goes through when he feels bad, all these shows him his own strength. Such a person can, from that moment, begin to accept and reveal it, and then his life will turn completely the other way, because the point is not what we do, but what meaning we put into our actions. If a person comes to you for a session in a certain state of mind, having realized that he needs to change motivation for his actions so everything in his life will sound differently, then this is a great success. It means you have managed to show him the power of his horoscope instead of highlighting of his weaknesses. When a person comes to an astrologist and hears what a weak and problematic horoscope he has, then this approach is wrong. Our task as astrologists is to elevate his position and to give him such inspiration that a person believes in himself more and no more give-ups are needed. I want to convey the idea that any position has potential, but it is untapped potential, and often our task is to help unleash this potential. And now we come back to the child, because everything begins in childhood. Everything begins where they just begin to take us in their arms, to nestle us to the chest, and the moment we appear, everything starts from our second house, which is the reflection of the eighth, or rather, the other way around, the eighth house is the reflection of the second. I will come to the question asked in the comments whether it is necessary to feed a child with Lagnesh in the 8th house in any particular way. In the previous video I've mentioned that it would be nice to pay special attention to nutrition, but I meant nutrition in its very general meaning. In the old Russian language there used to be such a word, to nurture. Now it is almost forgotten and not used. Instead, we use words like nursing or carrying, constantly loving, but at the same time constantly feeding, but feeding only when the child needs it. The 8th house is closely related to feeding and nourishment. The 8th house is closely related to fasting. But if a person has a lot of stress and has Lagnesh or Venus in the 8th house, or both of these planets at the same time, the more indicators, the stronger the sign will appear. The more likely such a person is to have problems. He begins to eat not because he is hungry, but because he is experiencing tremendous mental stress. Perhaps you have come across this, and many women also face this. Even if their 8th house is more or less alright, simply because it doesn't matter. Sooner or later everyone ends up in the 8th house, and we get there every day. And as soon as we have the stress, we run to the second house to remove it. We open the fridge and eat more to relieve stress, and this, of course, is not the best behavior that can be developed during life, because overeating shortens life. We should eat only when our body actually requires it. It all begins in childhood, with feeding. How should this happen according to biological laws? The child was born, and for 3 years he lives in close contact with his mother, body to body of the mother, constantly receives food from her at the first desire, at the first need. This happens day and night. They sleep together, and there is an important moment there. Use of a toilet. This is significant for him. If you have a child with an active 8th house, then for him these topics will be #1 topics in childhood: how he goes to the toilet, whether someone helps him or not. How was it in our pre-Soviet culture when we did not have so many maternity hospitals? Every child has the right to have his mother by his side, ideally, and at the same time she helps him to go to the toilet from the very beginning, from the very first day. If someone has gone through the basics of natural motherhood, who has practiced it, it would be a very close topic to you when a mother does not keep a child in a diaper. She is in tune with her child. She lives according to the baby's rhythms. And for the child to go to the toilet without stress, he needs to be given a breast. This may be a shocking statement for you, but in fact, in our culture, this is exactly what it used to be. A baby needs to be raised in such a way that as soon as he wants to use the toilet, he immediately needs to be given a breast, and he does go to the toilet. This is the first basic connection between the second and the eighth houses, and it is formed in infancy. If no one leaves the child at the same time, and he is absolutely supported in any reaction of his body, then he has a healthy psyche, healthy sexuality, healthy needs, and everything in this regard is normal. The balance between the mouth and the organs that excrete food is necessary. This biological balance must be maintained from the early age and these connections to be built effectively. And in the future, such a person will not need to prove anything through religion or other means, that he is loved in this universe. He already understands it. He feels that he is loved because he has had this support all the time. This happens not even at the level of consciousness, but at the level of internal perception of life. The eighth house is the house of shame and the fear of being dishonored, the fear that I might make a mistake. What if a person has come here to make mistakes? We all come here to make mistakes, but we think that now someone will punish us for the mistake, and then we have a lot of stress. It can come from childhood when someone, for example, mother, told you that you went to the toilet incorrectly. For example, somehow you did everything wrong. And this right of error, which every person has, begins to be denied in culture, and perfectionism becomes a thing. There is an illusion that you're loved only when you do everything correctly, and this is the axis of the second and the eighth houses. For those who have strong eighth house, it is very important to feel this support for both good and crisis situations, especially in the time of crisis. It is important for him to have the right to make a mistake, to have the right to do something unlike others, and to go through a situation of shame, to be ashamed together with his mother, and only then will such a person open up to life, instead of striving to compensate his need to grow to the level of others, all without being ashamed at the same time. The eighth house is the house of the most instinctive, very basic fears. Fear of shame, our sexual preferences that we can have, and this is the place where you can't tell everything to everyone. If in the childhood no one supported this area, no one accompanied the person in his fears, then he loses his connection, the root connection with this support, and it's easy to make him a victim, blame him. He will feel guilty of something. He may be scared to go out in public, because going out in public is always a chance to embarrass yourself, to make a mistake. Or when he's criticized, he starts to get very worried and again runs to the fridge and eats food as if he has done something wrong in his life. So let's summarize what parents should do if their child has an active eighth house. Especially if the child has Lagnesh, the Moon, Mercury, Venus or Mars there. What needs to be done and what to pay attention to in such a situation so that the child develops balanced and how to compensate this disharmony. This disharmony is the great stress at the body level. If Lagnesh is there, If there's the moon, then this is a constant tension in the psyche, fears, nightmares. Not the most positive pictures in the mind to which the child will pay attention, to various scary moments around him, and there are much more of them than you can imagine. Mercury is the formation of judgments that are associated with the area of the 8th house. These are the same fears, only more logical and meaningful. A person forms a judgment through the 8th house, that is, something terrible, something dangerous, or something interesting, mysterious. But when intelligence is formed in the 8th house, this is a special intelligence, this is unusual intelligence, this is intelligence of a researcher, and at first it can also be very intense. If Venus, then it is sexuality and relationships with people that are formed through the 8th house. If Mars, as a principle of action, as a principle associated with the fact that a child has the right to experiment and the right to make mistakes, the right to do something forbidden, this is of course the child's tendency to break the rules, to go where no one goes, climb into the secret places where you can lose it. And these things need to be monitored in accordance with the natural indicators of the planets. When the child is little, when he is just growing up. But what basic conditions should we meet when raising such a child? Firstly, compensatory development of his 2nd house, and give him a large amount of love, support, from his mother, primarily. It should come from the father's side as well, of course, but the father here plays the role of a person who supports the material resources of the family. And thus, mother's hands are freed, her mind is freed, and she does not need to think about how to make money, and she can dedicate 3 years only to biological needs of her child. The father's role could be the role of maintaining the 2nd house of the horoscope. Because no matter how they say now that the father should also participate in raising the baby, this is still not the case. You can trace this in astrology, see what part of the zodiac it is, dark or light. If it is dark, it means that the mother and mother's figures will have a greater influence on the personality through this area. If a child has grandmothers and especially great-grandmothers around him, then this is generally great luck. Because from the mother's side, a child can only get one kind of love, that is love and support, complete acceptance, and at the same time, this love is a discipline because the mother acts together with the child in his rhythms, and she must introduce him into these rhythms, and there is a certain moment of limitation through this love. There can be no limitation through the love of grandmother because she is more detached from the child in terms of specific care for him. And she gives this love in the form of certain permissiveness. This was also reflected in the culture. Great-grandmother's love is an even more sublime aspect of love. When a child can get a feeling of unconditional support and even some kind of hope that a great-grandmother can invest in a child, because a great-grandmother is already finishing her journey, the child is just beginning, and here the cycle of life is clearly visible, the cycle which is repeated in the family. The rebirth of family members into each other, and such a special connection can accrue between the child and his great-grandmother that can only be explained at the end of life by the person himself. The more love from different representatives of the generations, the better, the more the 8th house is compensated in childhood. Next, tradition. For a person who came here to break traditions, oddly enough, traditions are very important. If a person came with the planets in the 8th house, then for him, the task in this life is to break through to a new level, to break through the tradition, so that new traditions are built on the basis of his actions. But to get stronger for this action, it is necessary to rely on old traditions, the traditions of his family. What are traditions? Traditions present a person with an opportunity to spin in the wheel of life and to have a kind of protection at the same time, such as security tattoo. This is necessary in order to be sure that you will not be pushed anywhere, pushed into a dangerous situation, that you will simply revolve in these traditions. One holiday will be replaced by other holidays in life, and these holidays play a very important role, and they are lived by the child also through the 2nd house. What holidays do you have in your family? Birthdays, Christmas, New Year? If these traditions persist in the 1st, 2nd, and so on years in life, until the child builds a mature personality, he will have some support in life. He will know that now is the time to work, for example, or time to harvest. Here we celebrate the harvest festival and so on. Such cycles are very helpful for a child in his childhood, and especially for a child who came here with the task of breaking through to a new level. These cycles, the traditions that he receives from his family, will be his unshakable base. Next, we must talk about toilet and sexual affairs, where you need to accompany the child and in no case make fun of his flaws in any area. The very first are, of course, cases related to going to the toilet and things of the first manifestation of sexuality, which manifests itself already in infancy, in fact. In a child whose 8th house is filled with planets, sexuality can manifest itself very early and he will not know what to do with it, and the mother should be there to provide guidance on these issues, so that she is not afraid of these questions, to explain that this is normal, this is natural, and with this practically nothing needs to be done. This is one of the ways to relax the body, which is constantly in a tense state. Also, support the child in all his fears and nightmares, and in no case should you make fun of these things or say that they are somehow not important and he has thought them up to himself. It is also very important to follow the rule. Love comes in first place, acceptance comes next, and only then we will figure out what kind of crisis a person has had. Or if he comes to you from school and he has some kind of crisis, then do not attack him with the fact that he is to blame for the crisis himself. First, we give a basic sense of security, and then we figure out what really happened there. Visits to a doctor are also very important, because there a person is naked, a person is vulnerable, and this concerns injections, especially in those areas which are usually protected and where this fear of the 8th house is. And this can also hurt a child in childhood. The inability to discuss this with someone can disrupt the perception of his body, affect his sexuality, and then some kind of clamps may remain. It is necessary to supervise this area all the time, an area where a person can be hurt, because often no one talks about this. And with that, I will end this video. It again has turned out to be quite long. But I hope that I answered your question and uncovered the topic of interaction with the child through the 8th house, and outlined some of the basic and important points that should be taken into account. Thank you for your attention. Please leave your comments under this video, and I'll see you again very soon.